Hi there, I'm Carla Crim, Horticulture and Natural Resources Educator for Cornell Cooperative Extension of Delaware County. And today I am going to be talking to you about extending the season without the need for a greenhouse or a high tunnel. So just a little bit about me. In addition to being a full-time extension educator, I have a very small cut flower operation on my own property. I grow mostly varieties that are easy to dry and lavender. So I'm so busy during the summer that I need a product that I can really work with in the off season rather than during the main season. So that really works for me. In addition to that, I run a community garden operation that has a huge cut flower garden. And so it's been a really nice learning lab for me to be able to get my hands on the different varieties, learn about the struggles, the different conditions, and that ultimately has made me a lot better at serving our local flower farmers. So a lot of you are probably in your first or second season of growing cut flowers, and good for you. It's an amazing adventure that you're embarking on. Not without its heartaches, obviously, but something that can be so profitable and rewarding. And so, but one of the things that many successful flower farmers say over and over again is that you have to start small and invest as the money is coming in. So a high tunnel is a considerable investment, both in terms of land, resources, upkeep. And if you can do it, it's best not to go right into one of those out of the gate. There are other ways to get off to a quick start to your season. So that's what I'm going to get into today. Slide going. Okay, so these are the season extension strategies that I'm going to cover today, the ones that I'm quite familiar with. One of those is indoor growing. Quite a few of you probably already have your seeds started for the year. And I'm telling you, it's so nice to have those little green babies right inside your house. So I'll go into some details on how to do that. I'll also talk about a technique that's just exploded over the last few years. That is winter sowing. Certainly the use of row covers and low tunnels, which are affordable, easy to put up, easy to take down, a good thing to add to your toolbox of season extension. And then we'll talk about hardy varieties that really don't need as much in the way of protection, what they are, when to plant them. Succession planting, which can give you a normally short-lived crop for a much longer amount of time during the season. And then we'll talk a bit about the off-season products that you can sell so that money is still coming in when there's snow on the ground. Okay, so let's talk about things that you should consider when you're setting up to grow indoors. First of all, what type of space do you have available? My family and I have moved around a lot. Some of our homes have had great spaces with amazing light that really I didn't need to supplement a lot in terms of light and heat. That was really lucky. And then I've lived in places where there was not a square foot of space to set up for growing. And so I just squeeze it in between toys and pets and everything else. So it can be done even in tiny spaces, but to what degree? Another thing you need to consider, how well is the space insulated if you're going to be heating it? And then what is the air circulation like? Certainly from an energy perspective, it's great to have insulation so that you're not losing heat. However, you don't want to be in a situation that's absolutely stuffy. You do need air movement just to prevent fungal diseases. And then another thing to consider are actually the availability of water and electricity. Certainly in the early season, when you just have a little bit growing, if your growing space isn't handy to a water source, that's okay. You can just fill up a jug and go and pour it on there. But then as you get to closer to time to plant out, it can be a real chore carrying that much water for your watering needs. So that's just something to think about. Also, electricity, when you're thinking in terms of lighting, you want to make sure that you've got enough power and that you're not always tripping breakers or starting fires. Generally, with your more modern LED lights, it's not so much of a problem, but I actually, in my setup, pushed it a little bit too far the other day and hooked a lot of LED lights together, and I have to go downstairs and flip the breaker and come up with another scheme. So again, you just need to think about that. Also, space efficiency. Where can you put your setup so that it's kind of out of the way, but also convenient for you to access? One of the things that I've dealt with most of my growing career are pets and small children. My cats aren't too bad when it comes to things that are growing. They don't really mess with them. However, if I have an open container of soil, they immediately think litter box and use it. So I have to be really careful about that. But certainly, if you have small children, you need to, and even pets that are curious, you do need to consider that some of these varieties are toxic. Larkspur, for example, that they really shouldn't be eating or touching or anything. But also, it can be heartbreaking if a small creature gets into your little tiny seedlings. So just consider safety and convenience. And then off-season utility. If you're like me and you're just using it to get your starts going for the year, then you've got probably 8 months of the year that you're not really using these racks. And think about maybe using it as storage or a place to dry flowers, for example. Make it kind of earn its keep. So I'm showing a picture of a complete setup that's available from Johnny Seeds. I can't remember the exact price on it. It's pretty pricey, but it's nice. Everything's there, right? That's one direction you can go as far as getting a setup. Or there's numerous ways that you can set up your own growing racks. Certainly, the more affordable or even free or recycled that you can get, the better. I generally go with inexpensive wire racks, otherwise known as metro racks. I just get the ones that are the black powder coat. You can get them in so many different sizes and configuration, but the one that I find to be the most handy and affordable is actually the 4-tier. They're 2 foot, about 2 foot by a foot, and again, as many shelves as you want. If you put 2 of these together, they'll accommodate a 4-foot long shop light. I do, for some purposes, love the good old-fashioned fluorescent light bulbs. If you pair up a cool bulb with a warm bulb, they do provide the spectrum that the plants need, and they also give a tiny bit more warmth. So for things that really like it hot, like your celotias and zinnias, a lot of your vegetables, your tomatoes, you can actually put them under the grow light, and you won't, depending on the temperature of the room, you might not even need a heat mat. And then used in combination with a heat mat, you can really make those babies toasty warm if you want to. So yeah, the components are pretty affordable as far as you can get yourself a really nice setup for under $300. I've been experimenting with the LED shop lights. They work perfectly well. For what I do, again, I'm not year-round growing with them. I'm just doing germination or propagation. Works just fine. It is good to have an outlet strip on a timer. You can get the good old-fashioned timers that your parents used to set up when you go on vacation, or they even have power strips with the timer built in. So what are your reasons for needing indoor growing situation? Well, seed starting. That is my biggest reason for being set up to do this. Most of the things that we grow at the garden that I run and my garden at home are done from seed, and usually annuals with a small percentage of perennials. Annuals, you usually, you'll plant them every year. They'll flower, sometimes go to seed, do your thing. It's repeated every year. Whereas your perennials, you'll plant one time and it'll give and give and give, right? So it's in the very early season, like right now, I have a few things going that just take forever. That would be Lysianthus, which is a really popular, beautiful annual that takes about 8 months to go from seed to flower. And then eucalyptus, which is prized for its beautiful, fragrant foliage. I have those going. Those are really the only flower annuals I have going right now, but I'm about to that time where I'm going to be starting a whole lot more. But since I have some kind of empty space available, I take advantage of it and also germinate some perennials, which is just the gift that keeps on giving. As you know, perennials can be pretty expensive at a nursery, and rightfully so. They're in huge pots with a lot of soil, take up a lot of space. But if you don't mind kind of starting small and slow, you can grow hundreds of them for not a lot of money. And the nice thing is, with most perennials that are hardy to your zone, you can grow them, get a nice size little start, harden it off, and get it outside in the very early spring, so it's not taking up your space. So that's just the way they're designed to be. If that's something that has come up and is green out in your garden, then after you've hardened it off a little bit, it's ready to plop out. And same thing with the hardy annuals. We'll talk about that. They can go out quite early, free up space for your warm season annuals. But also vegetative propagation. This is something you can be doing over the summer. It's so easy. Your woody varieties, for example, that you have outside, like pussy willow, you can cut those, put them in water, and they'll root, and you'll have another plant to put out. Same with lavender. So, just a lot of your perennials that can be fussy to grow from seed, you can use that lighting, and you're set up to definitely propagate more. Also, a lot of people this time of year are sprouting tubers and bulbs that require a little bit of a head start. For example, ranunculus, which is incredibly difficult to grow because it does need an early start. It needs a very cool season to establish and really prefers to be under some sort of cover. Forcing bulbs, there are some people who grow lilies, tulips in crates in their basements. Just it's a matter of having the water and the lighting, and if they've been pre-chilled, they'll just come up. It's amazing. So and another thing, growing on plugs. You can buy, and we'll talk a little bit more about the advantages of plugs versus starting your own from seed, but the with plugs you can get 288 plugs for, depending on the variety, maybe $30 to $50, but they're little teeny tiny guys. Some things you can just put right out in the garden. They're going to do their thing. They're going to get big and produce for you that season. However, some of them, you may choose to get them in fairly early, get a huge amount of them, like 288, and then pot them up into larger pots so they can grow on a little bit more before you put them outside. But again, that takes up a lot of space. It takes time. So it's really a trade-off whether you might want to spend a little bit more on a plug tray that has less but bigger plants in it. Certainly, that's one of the risks you take with anything that you're growing from seed, is that the longer it's in your care, the more chances you have to kill it. I've had some real heartbreaks over the last few years where I would have some stuff going. It would look beautiful. For example, eucalyptus. I was so proud of myself. I think maybe even the ones in the picture were the victims. And I just forgot just one night, because they're in the little tiny soil blocks, at least the way I do it, forgetting one watering, they were crispy critters the next day. So that was a huge disappointment. So again, there's some advantages of going into the little tiny soil blocks and spending a long time growing them. But in some circumstances, it's kind of a risk management strategy just to get in the plants that you need at the size you need them when you need them. Okay, we're going to move on to winter sowing. And for those of you who are local to Delaware County, New York, I am actually doing a workshop in the office on February 17th on winter sowing. And it's such a fun thing to do. You get your hands dirty in the early winter, spring, when there's snow on the ground and you just want to be in touch with the earth. The wonderful thing about this is you don't need to take up any space in your home. Use supplemental lighting. It's very affordable. We all have containers kicking around, right? I have a gallon milk jug right here that I've been watering my plants with, in fact, and those are perfect containers. And anything that's a little bit challenging to start, because it does naturally require a little bit of a freeze thaw mechanism, that's very well suited to winter sowing. And another great thing about it is that you're using this container as a little bit of a mini greenhouse. By the time they've grown and are a size that's ready to plant out, they are hardened off and ready to go. So it's not like you're taking them from this warm, perfect, loving environment and putting them out into something harsh. So just a quick step-by-step on how the technique works. You just take your container and you want to cut it right around along the midline here. But I always leave the label area uncut, so it makes a little bit of a hinge. It keeps the two pieces together. And then you want to poke a couple little holes in the bottom for drainage. This is important because otherwise you do have the caps open and snow is getting in and out. And you want it to, it's almost like a natural rain cycle with that snow coming in and watering it, but then able to run through. And so you just add your potting soil and plant your seeds. Depending on the type of seed, you can plant just a few or sprinkle on a lot. I think the terminology they use in winter sowing groups for the ones that are really tightly sown, it's called hunk of seeds, HOS. So that's a thing. For little bitty things like snapdragons, that's great. You can sprinkle them on and then separate them out if you want them to get larger. The bigger things like sweet peas, lupins, things like that, you'd probably not want to put more than a dozen or so in a container because those plants germinate pretty large and will take up a lot of space. And yeah, so you just put in the soil, plant the seeds to the depth recommended for that seed variety. Your big things like the lupin and the peas will go in a little bit deeper and be covered with soil, whereas things like snapdragons would be more scattered on top. And you can certainly put a little bit of vermiculite on top of that if you want. I usually put plant labels right inside the container, but you can write on the container. The thing you have to be careful about, though, is don't use a regular Sharpie marker because that will fade. You can actually get garden markers at different garden stores and on Amazon. These are UV resistant and won't fade. And so, really, if you've got the fade proof marker, just go ahead and write on the jug because you're going to want to know what's in there while it's coming up, and you'll think you remember, but you don't. So yeah, you just tape it out and then you put them outside in the snow, put them on a picnic table somewhere they're relatively exposed, at least for this part of the winter, so that they can get sunshine, rain, snow, etc. They're just going to sit out there in the harshest conditions and they're not going to germinate until they're good and ready. And then when the nature cues tell them it's time to germinate, which is quite a bit earlier than they would be if they were just out exposed in the garden, they will just have this lovely greenhouse situation where they do that. The one thing you do have to be very careful about, though, is if you have a spell of warm temperatures or even just a day that it's kind of hot, you will definitely want to crack open those lids so that the plants can enjoy the air circulation. They won't get overheated. Cool loving plants will tend to bolt if it gets too hot and humid in there. So that's something you have to keep an eye on. And then once they're open, if you don't have any horribly low temperatures, you're probably okay. But if you're going to get an unexpected late freeze, then you just plop the lids right back on and uncover till it's time to plant. Okay, there are some disadvantages to winter sowing. The seeds do not germinate as fast or reliably as they would in an indoor setting because obviously they're not warm, they're not being babied. So you do want to over sow a bit because the germination rate won't be as high for some varieties. Also, if you have some unusual weather, which is pretty much all the time, I don't even know if there is such thing as unusual weather anymore. But if you have a situation where all your snow has melted and you have a really long, deep cold spell, then anything that's germinated is at risk. For example, one year, the first thing to come up were yarrow in probably early March. And I was so excited, they looked beautiful. And then it went down below 0 and they were killed off. The things that had not yet germinated, though, were fine. So, and generally snow is very insulating. So if everything's covered with snow cover, even if it gets very cold, they'll be okay. However, if you're in a situation where everything is bare, you may need to go ahead and cover those or move them to a spot that's slightly warmer. And then I mentioned the fact that they can bolt or fry if they get too hot. And my husband's biggest issue with it is it just looks nasty out in the yard, especially if you're like me and you grab your plants and kind of leave the jugs all over the yard. So that's not good. So there's ways certainly you can make it look tidier than I do. And you can use containers other than milk jugs. I've used different spice containers, for example, and you just want to make sure that the hole in the lid is large enough to let snow in and that the amount of soil you have in there is sufficient and not just an inch or so of soil, but a couple inches. Okay, so now we're going to move on up to the concept of row covers. Row covers are a game changer. Not only do they give you a few extra degrees of warmth depending on the cover, but they also keep pests at bay. So the easiest way to use row cover is just to float it. Put it right down on the plants. Certainly you'll need something to keep it in place so it doesn't blow away in the wind. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But, you know, a lot of these little things that you plant out in the early season, they're just little rosettes with no flowers sticking out of them at all. Those won't actually come until the weather is nice. So this works with little things that are in that kind of state. And even if depending on the plant, they can get snow on top of them, doesn't hurt anything, won't crush them. So that's one option. The one I really like to use are flexible wire hoops. They're available from Johnny's. I think they're, a good 5 foot long minimum. They might have some in different sizes. But when you put those in the ground and bend them, they create a pretty stable support for most row covers. And certainly if you get a big heavy snowfall, it will smush it. But in most cases, depending on how they're spaced, they'll hold up pretty well. So that's what I use for most applications. You can also get pre-bent wire hoops that have a little bit more durability to them. They're not as convenient because a flexible wire hoop, you just pull out of the ground and you can just store flat, right? But the pre-bent ones obviously take up that footprint. People are using cattle panels a lot. You can get those at places like Tractor Supply. They're large and durable, relatively rust-free compared to, say, concrete reinforcing wire. So people use those to create hoop structures and then later on in the season use them for trellising. So that's pretty convenient. They are large and costly, so you'll need some help getting them home, but they work pretty well. There's also custom-made trellis systems that you can buy. For example, we buy one from Knowles Produce Supply that is touted as a tomato support, but it's just this really cool welded kind of ladder shaped piece that has hooks for attaching twine or however you want to secure anything, and then it also has a custom sized row cover that goes with it. So that's pretty sharp. You can get as fancy as you want. If you're getting into larger, more permanent type structures, then that's where you're getting into things like PVC pipe, electrical conduit. You can actually, for the electrical conduit, buy templates or even make templates so that you can bend them the same size consistently. And those can be secured different ways, but I think the most popular way is to drive rebar stakes in beside the beds and attach the ends of the pipe or the conduit that way. Okay, so now we're going to get into the types of row cover that you can use for different applications. One of my favorite is actually insect netting. This is something, I believe the trade name is Protects net netting, and there's also other variations on this. It's almost like a terrible pantyhose material. It's a knit, and it stretches out. You want to bury the sides of it, if possible, in the soil. This doesn't add any extra heat, but it is so great for keeping off things like flea beetles, Japanese beetles, even slugs, if it's installed correctly and there aren't already slugs in the soil. We really rely on this in the early season for a lot of our brassicas. If you're trying to grow something like aster, for example, that will keep the leaf poppers off. And just even having that little bit of protection while the plants are establishing in the early spring until they kind of get too big to outgrow it, that'll really give you a leg up on the season. And then we get into our non-woven fabrics. There's different names, different materials that they're made out of, but the popular ones are Agribon and I believe Rime. And we'll talk about the different weights in a coming slide. Then there are shade nettings. There are a lot of varieties that do better, get taller, if they're not blasted out with heat. And this is a way you can actually extend your early spring when you're starting to get into those temperatures, especially depending on your climate, where, for example, ranunculus really doesn't like hot, dry conditions and will start to wither. But the little bit of the shade netting will cool it a few degrees and prevent bolting to some degree. Okay, and then plastic. And just like with the non-woven fabrics, there are a variety of weights and purposes. Certainly, the heavier it is, the more heat it will hold in. The thicker it is, though, the less light is transmitted. That's certainly with any sort of row cover. Really, I only look to use plastics when I'm trying to overwinter something or, just really get a leg up on the season. But I don't like to use it once it gets warm, just because it doesn't breathe. And as we were talking about with the winter sowing, if you have a hot sunny day, it's pretty easy to cook your little seedlings. So that's one of the things you have to be so careful about, is once it gets warm, taking that plastic on and off, or at least venting it. That's appropriate. And then netting. We're going to get in a little bit more details. I talked about how it keeps out the different pests. You can actually get netting with larger holes in it, depending on the type of pest you're dealing with. For example, if birds and larger insects are your problem, then a finer netting or a wider mesh netting might be more appropriate. And again, it just, the advantage of netting over a non-woven is the fact that it does breathe and doesn't give you the temperature increase. So Agribon, let's compare the different weights and advantages and disadvantages. So the standard weight of Agribon, AG19, gives you about 2 to 4 degrees of frost protection, in addition to, so say your plant gets unhappy at 32 degrees. So if it was 32 outside, this would get you through that little bit of dip, but it certainly wouldn't help you if you got down to 12. It lets most of your light through and is very light, easy to store. So that's the standard. Then you go up to the medium, which is pretty much my go-to, just because it is multi-purpose. It doesn't let in as much light, but it gives you 4 to 6 degrees of frost protection, and still obviously keeps out the pests and is a good just go-to. Then you get into your heavier weight ones, your heavy and your extra heavy. They don't let nearly as much light through, but they do add quite a bit of extra warmth. So this is a great thing, for example, in your very, very early season. If you just don't want stuff to frost, then you can use a heavy or an extra heavy. We use it routinely on things like squash and tomatoes that are just real heat lovers, and we are trying to push the season. And don't be too put off by the reduction in light transmission. You've got to realize that your indoor growing situation or greenhouse, the light transmission is way reduced, even with artificial lighting, compared to what you would get out in the sun. So the sun is pumping out lots and lots of rays for these guys. It's just a matter of the timing, how long you use it. Certainly, it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for the plant's entire life cycle, but getting them off to a good start, a little bit of light reduction isn't a deal breaker. Okay, so let's talk about how do we hold these row covers in place, right? That can be the biggest barrier to actually using them. Certainly, the ideal thing with any of these is to be able to bury the sides in soil. However, the disadvantage is that you can't be lifting up your cover all the time and looking at your little babies or adding amendments or anything like that. Really, you need to, if you're going to cover them in soil, you're more likely to get them in there and just kind of trust the process. Maybe peek in at the ends of the tunnels, make sure they're doing okay. But otherwise, you're going to leave them alone until it's time for the covers to come off. We are in a very rocky area, so rocks are kind of my go-to anchor at home. They are everywhere. They're big, they're heavy. I don't like carrying them around, but they're abundant and they're right where I need them because they're everywhere. At our community garden, which is considerably tidier, we actually use bricks as our anchor. They stack well, they hold the covers in place. They're really ideal for that setting. And certainly the more bricks you use, the better things hold into place. And I found that the heavier covers tend to blow off more, probably because the breeze can't just blow through them, right? It kind of picks them up and they take off if they're not well secured. Another option, logs, depending on, if you're clearing land, you probably have logs all over the place, right? Small pieces of lumber or logs, you can just put those right down to hold them in place. A lot of folks use sandbags, and you don't have to fill them with sand. You can just fill them with your soil. They're nice and convenient because you can just, carry your box of bags out there, fill them up. If you want to bring them up in at any point, you just dump them out right back into the land, right? Landscape pins are another option. However, they can cause the row cover to tear and are a bit of a pain to take in and out. And again, just like with soil, just once you've got it in place, you're not peeking as much. The nice thing about the bricks and the rocks is you can pull them off and peek under there, right? Also, as shown in this little image, you can buy pipe clips, which secure your cover right to whatever infrastructure you have, whether it's conduit pipe or PVC pipe. And then an affordable, pretty easy to access option that's easier to take on and off are binder clamps. I found the pipe clips really hard to get on and off, but binder clamps, the big ones, you just clamp down. Okay, so now let's talk about extending your season, not so much with structures, but with the different varieties that you're growing. So of course, your hardiest of hardy varieties are going to be your bulbs. You've got things like daffodils, tulips. You plop those in the fall, and you've got flowers in the very early spring. Then there are your perennials. Peonies are sort of our dream spring plant here because they're big, showy, focal flowers that are easy to grow, come back every year, very, very priced, smell amazing, easy to store. In fact, that's another whole topic, but tulips can actually, well, tulips and peonies can be kept for extended periods in the cooler if they're harvested properly. And then also some of the other things that are great in the early spring are your woodies. You have your things like forsythia that have flowers on them that can actually be forced to bloom earlier even than they would naturally. You have beautiful things like pussy willows, viburnums. There's all types of large perennials that you plant those once and they just produce for you year after year. So certainly that's a good sort of long-term strategy for having material to work with in the very early spring. And for us in the Northeast, really, if you've got flowers in June, you're doing pretty good. Other than, you know, your bulb varieties, if you're getting some nice peonies and other perennials in the early spring, you can make some beautiful bouquets. So just some examples of the bulbs, and I'm sure these are pretty commonly known to everyone. Daffodils, tulips, alliums are really beautiful members of the onion family that have a really pretty purple, showy pom-pom head. Anemones, and then we've talked about ranunculus. Daffodils are great and easy. Most everybody has them already on your property. They're affordable. You put them in, gift that keeps on giving, right? Tulips are grown more like annuals. Folks buy the bulbs in the fall, plant them, and then pull the whole plant with the bulb on it all and just get rid of the bulb, give it to a friend, put it on another part of their property, because most of that good energy is gone into that flower and the leaves, which you want to give to your customer, right? So another thing about tulips is pricing really matters, as far as you do want to try to get your bulbs wholesale from a reputable dealer. There's certainly places online that tout themselves as wholesale dealers, but then you look at the pricing and it's like 50 to 60 cents a bulb or more. And there's really not a lot of room for profit in there. So definitely work with somebody like Ball Horticultural that is able to give you the pricing. Now, that said, if you're a smaller grower, you may not need as many as the minimum that they sell for wholesale. And that's when you want to start getting into sharing and cooperatives, etc. Whole other topic. With any of these topics, there's just so many different directions we can go, right? Okay, let's talk about some of our favorite early blooming perennials. One of my absolute favorites shown here is Lady's Mantle. It has this beautiful greenish yellowish foliage, very soft velvety leaves, comes on super early in the spring, nice long stem length, makes a great filler, just spreads, happy little plant. We've already talked about peony. Delphinium, beautiful blue spikes, again a perennial, comes back year after year, looks beautiful in bouquets, people adore it. Columbines have sweet little faces, again easy to grow, they can take quite a bit of shade, as can foxglove that's listed right below it. And then Veronica is another nice spiky variety. So these are what I feel like are must-haves. Actually, behind the Lady's Mantle in this picture is Beard's Tongue. I believe it's penstemon, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. That's one of those things that I read but don't necessarily hear as often. But it has beautiful burgundy foliage, white or pink flowers, and it's a native plant. So we're supporting our native pollinators. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about cool season hardy annuals. And the queen of cool flowers is Lisa Mason Ziegler of Gardener's Workshop. I recommend her podcast, her website. She is just such a mentor to all the growers out there and has really demystified the concept of cool flowers. And as she likes to say it, these are the varieties that our grandmas grew. They knew the tricks to get those out there. These are really considered old-fashioned flowers. These are not ones that you see so much in the garden centers just because they're not blooming when the shoppers are out there buying their bedding plants, right? So these generally we have to start ourselves, but there are so many good varieties. And what's hardy for you just really depends on your zone. So I'm in zone 5A, which is pretty darn cold. And a lot of the varieties listed in her book that she would plant the previous fall, I cannot. So for me, planting cool flowers is usually dependent on starting indoors 6 to 8 weeks. Well, actually, starting indoors like 10 to 12 weeks before my last frost, and then planting them out into the garden beds 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost. So it's still nasty at that point. It's wet, it's cold. Some varieties don't care. You can plop them in there and they're just going to weather it and do great, be perfectly happy. But other varieties benefit from a cover, whether it be floating row cover, something supported by a wire. It's certainly helpful. It also, just protects, as I mentioned, from pests in the early season. Some of the very popular cool season hardy annuals that I grow include snapdragons, which are so easy. They're little tiny seeds. They grow slowly. They're definitely easier than Lysianthus, but they come in just such a beautiful range of colors. They're a type of plant, though, that has different blooming maturity groups. So, and I'm probably not even getting that terminology correct, but basically, some varieties are more suited to your cold seasons, like your early spring or late fall. And then other varieties are better in the heat of summer, and some are just good all-purpose varieties. So I grow a lot of the Rocket and Potomac varieties. Those seem to do well in our climate. Larkspur is another one. And a lot of these varieties, if you can get these to go to seed and shed seeds, you will have them year after year, looking pretty much as good as the parent plant. Sometimes the snapdragon volunteers, as we call them, come up a little bit short for what we would like, but you have things like Larkspur, Rudbeckia. Their babies are great and healthy, and it's sort of an insurance policy. If you grow those once, you will always have them. I've mentioned Lysianthus a couple times. That is definitely a cool flower that loves to grow out early. I mentioned, though, that it is extremely slow to grow from seeds. So for the most part, my strategy for that one is to buy it in from plugs at the size that I want to put them out. So the 125 size, I will harden those off for a day and they're right out into the garden after they arrive, just because I don't want to babysit them for so long. That said, I wanted to see if I could rise to the challenge of growing Lysianthus from seed, and I'm happy to report it's no different than snapdragons or any other tiny little slow grower. They are pretty susceptible to fungal diseases, so it's helpful to add an antimicrobial. There are a lot of biological fungicides now that are recommended for that. Rudbeckia, Stock, Bells of Ireland, these are all very beautiful, valued plants that you can grow. So let's say I get the plant out 6 to 8 weeks before my last frost, I can pretty much count on mid to late June, I'll start to have flowers. They'll produce through July, kind of peter out mid-July when it gets hot. But by then you've got so many things coming in like cosmos and zinnias that you just really think of it as transition from what grows best in what season. Just a brief list of some woodies that are great to have for either their foliage, flowers, sometimes even fruits. A lot of them are native, so you're also supporting wildlife. This is a good time of year actually to go to your soil and water conservation office in your county or to the New York State nursery and order some plants for the spring. Most of them have plant sales going on February through March. Usually early March is the cutoff, but they will sell these varieties bare root very inexpensively in bulk. And if you have property with some maybe not so desirable areas for garden beds, it's great to just get those in there, and then you just go out and clip, right? So just the list is on the left. 9-bark, viburnum, really great for foliage. Viburnum has really fragrant, lovely flowers that come on early. Raspberry, especially the thornless raspberries, gives amazing foliage. Winterberry, these sell great at holiday markets, just bunched up with those blazing red berries, very, very popular. Smoke tree, those big poofy fluff branches are so nice to incorporate into arrangements. Chokecherry, otherwise known as chokeberry, aronia, that produces a very tart berry that literally makes you pucker up, but can be used most time of the year to really add a lot of interest to your bouquets. Hydrangea, which just comes in such an array of colors and sizes and shapes and styles. Pretty easy to grow. There's different types that have different pruning requirements, but most of your big woody varieties are very low maintenance. And then pussy willows. Not enough people are growing pussy willows, especially if you have wet land. You can buy these in right now as sticks from a lot of folks online, and that are either starting to root or that will very quickly root. And then you can just put those out on your property. Okay, so I mentioned succession planting earlier. And so there's really no magic to it other than just consistency. You need to figure out for the variety that you want, how often you need to plant it, and how late can you plant it. So for example, sunflowers, generally we're done planting sunflowers in late July, and we know that they'll be done by mid-September. But some years we don't get a frost until early October, and we've really missed out on a beautiful fall looking flower that customers would love to have. So you think about it, how much do sunflower seeds cost, and what if you might get a frost, but you plant $5 worth of sunflower seeds, that might translate to $250 to $500. Or you might have a frost and not get it. So I think it's worth the risk. And really any of these that are listed, certainly they're sensitive to being hit by frost, but their life cycle is so short that you can put in a later succession, probably after some of your cool season hardy annuals have come out, they're shot, the heat has knocked them out, it's late July, early August, but throw some seeds in those spaces, or just take a risk that this could give you flowers into October. And if you are set up with all your infrastructure for row covers, you can cover some of your smaller varieties and keep them going through a light frost. And some of them will even take a little bit of frost and then start producing flowers again. So, we always have, it seems like we'll get hit pretty hard either late September and then have a long stretch that's beautiful. So it's heartbreaking, but it's just the reality. And then this is sort of my business model here is I do rely on selling in the off season, and it's not so much because, I have to, it's just because that's what works with my work schedule. And actually the type of things I like to do. And I'm really into crafts, and I just love the different dried varieties. So it works really well for me. But certainly that's not your only option. Many flower farmers actually sell plants in the early season. In New York State, it's very easy to get a nursery license. I think it's $100 for 2 years. They come and inspect the area where you're growing. So that would mean they'd have to come upstairs, maybe trip over a couple of dog toys and look at my growing rack up here in my sowing room. And but they just need to see it and make sure you're not harboring invasive species or pests. They give you your license and you can sell plants. And so people are really interested in growing these cutting and drying varieties that you're not finding in the nursery. You can really promote that as value added. But of course, you can also grow your common varieties. I wouldn't try to compete too much with the big box stores or your regular nurseries, I would recommend keeping it unique and interesting and having a story behind it. But that's certainly a good way. I always grow way too much just because I'm convinced something's going to fail, there's going to be low germination, and then I'm stuck with way more plants than I need. So this is sort of the perfect thing. Talk quite a bit about dried flowers. Not only they work really well in the late fall, perfect for fall markets, even holiday markets, depending on how you package them. I like to add in for the Christmas markets, things like dried orange slices or pine cones on sticks. Just stick that in the bouquet and all of a sudden it's festive, right? Or depending on the wraps that you use. And then if you don't sell them at the winter markets, no big deal. You've got Valentine's and Mother's Day coming up in the spring, and they can certainly work for that as well. So many crafts that you can make, like wreaths. A lot of brides are actually embracing dried flowers. So definitely a market for that. Garlic is another wonderful thing that you can kind of grow quietly alongside your flowers. Harvest it mid-July. There you've got space for another late succession, right? But that's something that you can have at your farm stand or your show. You can braid it, add some dried flowers to it. It's just nice to have. Same with pumpkins and gourds. They can be a little bit tricky as far as they're susceptible to fungal diseases and they do take up a lot of space. However, the smaller varieties like the mini pumpkins, mini gourds, they're great for decorating with flowers and easy to kind of haul around and display. So a good little addition to have. Holiday greenery certainly is easy enough to forage. The best source I have found for greenery are actually Christmas tree farms. They generate so much, I don't even want to call it waste, but so many beautiful branches come off when they're prepping that tree to get loaded up. So, and they're always just so friendly and willing, unless they have their own sort of wreath making operation. And even in that case, generally they have more than they can deal with. So that's really helpful. Most of the species of evergreens on my property that grow really well aren't necessarily the most suitable for holiday arrangements because they tend to shed their needles. I have hemlock and white pine. They're beautiful. They smell good, but they drop their needles. I have Norway spruce that holds up really well, but it's kind of got a droopy look to it. So the use is limited. But if you feel like holiday greenery is something that you want to focus on, you can get fir trees from these soil and water sales. For example, you get them as little tiny saplings, little Charlie Brown Christmas trees, put them out, and then in a few years, you will have something that you can cut from. It won't maintain its perfect, beautiful shape, obviously, if you're cutting on it, but if these are just kind of your harvest trees, then that's a good strategy. Other greenery, it doesn't necessarily have to be fir. You can have things like rhododendron. If you're further down south, I love magnolia leaves. So then certainly thinking ahead to your main season, you can sell CSA subscriptions any time of the year. They make great gifts. So those Christmas, Mother's Day, birthdays, those you can always sell, right? And the more attractive that you make it, the better as far as gift cards or CSA certificates, something that someone can give to another one. So it's definitely working on your presentation for that. And then if you have social media, that's certainly a great way to market these products or just market alongside whatever else you have. Wholesale blooms, if you are near a wholesaler, you can buy plants grown in different parts of the country or around the world. Certainly that's not ideal because we really do want to emphasize locally grown. That's part of your brand. That's part of your label. However, there are things that you can purchase that still have the same look and feel as what you're growing in the main season that can be purchased affordably from a wholesaler and maybe combined with things that you can forage in the off season. And then might even want to consider your brand involving some sort of other craft or food product that pairs well with flowers, for example, bread or sweets. They would look really beautiful together. So, or maybe even partnering with somebody who has these items and selling them with the limited amount that you have available in the off season. So just, you can absolutely get creative with it. But another thing to consider is maybe embrace this off season as a time to regroup and reflect, and not necessarily be out there bringing in the money. If you are successful and busy in the off season, then give yourself the grace to take some time when the snow is on the ground. So I know for my family, we do farmers markets in the summer. So the winter just is so nice to get projects done around the house and enjoy the season, right? And planning takes a lot of time. And the more you do now, the better your season is going to be in terms of coming up with your crop plans, coming up with spreadsheets on how you're going to track profitability. You can also make quite a bit of money these days doing a side hustle. Restaurants, fast food, retail. So they're not as fun or nice as being outside, but if you can get some money in the bank, that gives you breathing room during the season, and you're not struggling to justify spending $300 or $400 on seed, right? You've made that in a couple of shifts doing this side hustle. It can be a lot of fun just to do something nice. And then also just take the time and practice a little self-care and relax a little bit. You go through a lot physically and emotionally during the growing season, and take a vacation. I know that's easier said than done, right? But also this is your learning season. In fact, this is why at Cooperative Extension, for example, we consider January and February our education months. We go to workshops, we do workshops, and it's because we're not wrapped up in that crazy growing season. It is the time to sort of fill our minds with ideas and plans. And that is all I have for today. I actually re-recorded the session because I failed to record it live. And, I did get good questions from the audience in the live session, but I tried to make sure I covered anything here. But if you do have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to me. My email is ceh27@cornell.edu. C as in car, E as in egg, H as in house, number 27@cornell.edu, and I will help you the best I can. Thank you so much for joining us today, and be sure to check out our other production risk management series videos. Thank you.